Nearly every subject that historians look at is placed within its historical context, the cultural and political context of its time. And historians are used to doing this with every body of literature, except one, the New Testament, Christianity. And our own purpose was to finally place the New Testament within its cultural context, its political context. It is only within the cultural and political context of the first 2 centuries that Christianity can be understood. And so using the standard methods of historians, interdisciplinary methods, archaeology, numismology, and of course the ancient texts themselves, putting all of that evidence together to explain the context for how and where Christianity emerged.
What happened was we first came across evidence that was astonishing and implied something we had never imagined. And so we didn't start out just trying to do this because there would be no point. The thing is, we saw something that told us there's an avenue that's never been explored before in the history of Christianity. And we opened that door and decided to follow it wherever it led. And it led to places that were more astonishing than we could possibly have imagined.
Well, this is true. We realize Christianity is probably the single biggest influence in the history of Western civilization, still the most important religion in the world today. And we wanted to use the standard methods to place Christianity into its historical context, sort of for the first time, just as historians do with any other body of literature or any other subject. And it is only by understanding the political and cultural context of the first 2 centuries that one can really understand the emergence of Christianity.
And of course that was impossible to do until the last 3 centuries, when you wouldn't get burned at the stake or charged with heresy, which could often lead to being executed. So in the last 3 centuries only have these things been explored the way historians would explore any other text. The only time that people could look at history in the way that we've been able to look at all other parts of history, because Christianity was the predominant force that did not allow these kinds of inquiries until the last centuries.
And of course, only in the last century and a half have critical scholars began to read carefully and analyze the texts of the New Testament, begin to understand the relationship between them. And only within the last century or so have important text discoveries, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls in the middle of the 20th century, or several decades earlier, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt. That, as well as archaeological finds and the classification of Roman coins, for example, have allowed us to do this kind of research and use a variety of disciplines to coordinate on the central truth that we had found.
We've known each other since elementary school, and we have often, we've all our lives been interested in history and in philosophy and in religion. It wasn't until I was in my 20s in 1983 when my friend James suddenly crawled through my window of my apartment and woke me up, and I said, "This better be good." And he had been looking all night at texts, reading Josephus, and came across an astounding insight that led to the last 35 years of research until our book was finally written. I myself went on to become a novelist. I write science thrillers, been published by Random House, HarperCollins, and in 18 languages around the world. So I'm used to studying and researching very thoroughly the subject of the novels that I've been writing, and they do require a great deal of research. So bringing those writing skills and research experience to the table to work with James, who is himself a scholar, was the magic formula that took 3 decades to finally put this book together. And that's why we're almost like brothers at this point. One hand knows what the other one's doing. We're half of each other's brain. And it lessened the work of research and writing to accomplish.
I myself was raised a Christian, and as a child was deeply interested in Christianity, a devout Christian, and developed a lot of background knowledge by reading both the Bible and secondary literature at a very early age. And even as I became less religious, I knew I wanted to utilize that knowledge in a specific way. I knew a lot about it. And then I studied philosophy at New York University. I studied history at New York University, went on to become a lawyer For 18 years, I was a public prosecutor, a deputy district attorney for San Diego County. And in the process of that, I learned forensics, how to figure out what happened behind a crime, how to figure out the backstory. And that training in investigation and in sort of scientific inference was absolutely essential to my ability to put all the various pieces of this together. And when I retired from that, I pretty much devoted myself to this subject and creating Christ as the result.
Over the years, we would get together and hash out one stunning coincidence after another that we had discovered in the texts and all kinds of surrounding texts that describe the history and the context from which Christianity emerged. And as we did that, every time we challenged the assumption, the thesis that we were developing, and we looked in a certain direction to see if we could disprove what we were starting to believe was the case, every single time it turned out that we were correct. What we found was an astonishing confirmation of the thesis that we were testing.
And if I can just say, initially, even to us, even to ourselves, the thesis sounded kind of crazy. It sounded so unconventional. It sounded so counterintuitive from the way Hollywood tells the story, for example, of the greatest story ever told, that we questioned ourselves. And we had made the discovery that there was a connection between the Jewish war of the first century, a cataclysmic war that was religiously motivated in the first century, and the emergence of Christianity could not simply have been accidentally occurring at the same time. That the two events, this religiously motivated war led by Messianic Jews, violent, nationalist, militant Messianic Jews, and the emergence of a pacifistic form of Messianic Judaism at the same time could not simply be a coincidence. Scholarly consensus has placed the writing of the New Testament at the middle or toward the end of the first century AD. At precisely this time, a cataclysmic, apocalyptic war between religiously motivated Jewish nationalists and the Roman Empire was taking place. A war that both pagan and Jewish historians of the period have identified as a religiously motivated war, specifically a war motivated by the messianic prophecies contained in Hebrew literature. But the Messiah that they were seeking in the first century was a real military and political Messiah who would bring earthly triumph and rule to the Hebrew people. Unfortunately, it was a failure, an apocalyptic failure on the part of the Jewish nationalists. It is the war that reduced the temple, the one temple of the Jewish God, to the Wailing Wall that it is today, to the Wailing Wall still venerated by Jews even to this day. It is a war that has had reverberating consequences for the last 2,000 years, generating, if you will, both rabbinic Judaism as it exists today and what we know of as Christianity as well. The source of the major religions in the West today.
The religious innovations that arose from this point in history, from this point of Jewish conflagration and Roman war, would affect the world for the next 2,000 years right up to the present.
In 2001, following the devastating attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, we were told by Western leaders that Islam was a religion of peace. And very similarly, back in the first 2 centuries, Rome was busily trying to convince Jews that their religion was a religion of peace. Even to this day, Christianity influences the way people live, the way people think, the politics on both the left and the right, both citing the Bible as moral authority for the basis of their different political. They're struggling, if you will, for the moral high ground using Christianity itself 2,000 years later.
Whether you like it or not, these events in the first century still affect you and everyone else to this day. What if you were an historian with no religious bias whatsoever and began looking at the evidence, coins, architecture, text, histories, all passed down to us from this era when Christianity emerged? What would you conclude just based on the evidence itself? Could you set aside your biases and your beliefs and look at all of this evidence with a fresh eye. That's what we're going to do in this documentary. And we're now going to show you the truth of how all of this began.